Hey guys, it's Sarah, and today I'm bringing to you a wrap-up of an experiment that I did. I have always wanted to do this video concept. I am by no means the inventor of it. It's been done many times before. People have even uploaded this concept this year. But essentially, as you can see in the video title, I chose 6 booktubers, and I read their favorite books from 2020. I tried to pick booktubers with fairly different reading tastes than me. There's a few people who I typically align with, but most of them I do not. I know I probably should have vlogged this video concept. I know that's all the rage right now on BookTube. Hopefully down the line this year, I will, get around to making a reading vlog. But most days I look like, how should I put this? Complete ass. The pandemic has just really brought me to rock bottom. Most days my hair is barely washed. I don't feel my best. I don't look my best. I don't put on real clothes. I actually started a new job during the pandemic, and my coworkers have never met me in person. And honestly, I feel like I'm doing what I like to call reverse catfishing, where I look absolutely horrible on Zoom. And when we eventually go back to the office in person, they're gonna be like, "Oh, you're not ugly." And I'm gonna be like, "Surprise." And then I'm gonna look like this. But this time around, I thought it would be a lot easier just to read the books at my own pace and not worry about vlogging it and then just wrap it up for you guys now. So let's just get into that.
This book is like a cup of warm, hot chocolate on a cold day, a fuzzy blanket next to a fireplace. This book is just warm, fuzzy, happy.
The first book I read for this experiment was The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. I read this because the very dear Elias said this is one of his favorite books of all time. I feel like last year, anytime I saw someone saying they read this, his name was typically attached as the recommender? Is that a word? To give you a quick synopsis of this book, it is about a character named Linus Baker who is a caseworker for this magical department for children with abilities. And so he essentially travels around to different orphanages, checking in on them and making sure that the magical children are being treated well. Linus typically has a very sterile approach to how he goes to these orphanages. He doesn't have a lot of feelings or emotion that go into it, but going to this island is a very magical and special experience for him, and it sort of is just a found family, very wholesome story about what happens when he goes to this island. And I don't know how to describe this story other than saying it is so warm and wholesome. It feels like one of those books that would transcend most people's reading tastes, just because it's just such a touching story. I could totally picture it being almost like a Pixar movie. That's kind of the energy it gives me. It tickled my soul. That's not a saying, is it? Warmed my soul. It made me feel really good reading it. It's just a feel-good book. If you are feeling down and you want a little pick-me-up, I highly recommend reading this. I absolutely agree with Elias on this one. I think he's so right as having this as one of his favorite books. I definitely could see myself rereading it. Typically, if I can see myself rereading something, that's how I know that I really liked it. It was just so cute.
And this book was just so wild, so crazy, so many twists and turns and plot twists that I did not see coming.
The next book on my list is The First Sister by Linden A. Lewis, and this is a recommendation from the lovely Riley. I actually added this to my TBR when she mentioned it in a reading vlog at some point last year. I think she did a reading vlog where she read genres she doesn't typically read, and this book is sci-fi, and I think that's a genre that she likes but wants to get into more. And then she listed it in her favorites of the year, so I thought it would be a perfect time to read it. This is a sci-fi space opera in which Mars and Venus have been colonized, and there are these two opposing empires, one of which is backed by religion. They follow very close teachings of a goddess, and then the other empire is more backed by science and experiments, and our main characters kind of fall into both of these camps. So I'll just come out and say it. Sci-fi is not really a genre that I read too often, but I absolutely loved this book. One of my favorite things about this book was the issues it chose to focus on. There definitely was the science versus religion aspect. There was different things that these characters were fighting about, discovering that your government isn't as good as you thought it was, and all of that. That was super interesting. But what I really enjoyed was that gender, sexuality, and race were not the main issues. I feel like a lot of times fantasy and sci-fi books will take all of the issues that we have in today's society and just mirror them in their world building. And I felt like Linden A. Lewis took a very interesting approach by kind of making all of those things a non-issue. Hero being non-binary didn't really do anything with the plot. It was just kind of people knew that their pronouns were they, them, and they all respected that. And then the first sister is actually described as being bisexual. And there's also a sapphic romance in this book. I don't know, sometimes I just don't want to read about all the things that we already have to deal with in today's society. It can be good, there's a time and place for it, but it's also cool when an author takes a more creative license to explore other issues more deeply. I'm gonna go ahead and second Riley's recommendation of this book. I think if you like sci-fi or fantasy at all, you'd really enjoy this. The world building was really solid, the characters were really great, and I think it's gonna shape up to be a really great series, and I highly recommend it.
I can't think about this book without crying. I loved these characters so much. I feel like they seared themselves onto my heart.
The next book on this list is We Are Not Free by Traci Chee. That rhymed. This was recommended by the very lovely Monica Kim. This story is about the mass incarcerations of Japanese Americans during World War II. It follows 14 teens who are a very tight-knit friend group and how they all get taken from their home in Japantown in San Francisco and put into a internment camp, essentially. And so every chapter is a different person's perspective. So there's basically, like I said, there's 14 teens, so there's 14 chapters of different people. I feel like the mass incarcerations of Japanese Americans is very glossed over in history classes. Like, obviously we spend a lot of time talking about the Holocaust and obviously like what happened to Jewish people, but I feel like there were a lot of things happening in the US that not a lot of people talk about. Like after World War II, all these Japanese Americans being forced out of their homes is definitely a very sad part of American history that I feel like there's just not enough like books about. I think my issue with this book has nothing to do with the content at all, but more to do with the writing and the pacing and the fact that it had 14 perspectives. I did not love that aspect. It made it really hard for me to connect to the characters. It was just hard, and certain chapters were better than others. Like there were a couple of characters that I absolutely loved and their stories like were so touching and they made me cry, but then there were other chapters that I wasn't as into, and so I would give this roughly like a 2.5 to 3 stars. Like I give it 3 stars just because the content and the topic are so important. I could totally see this being a book that students read in their English class in high school. I think this would be like a great book to dissect and talk about, but as far as like my reading enjoyment and just like what I want to pick up, I just didn't really enjoy it. But like I said, the topic is super important, so I know I'm kind of torn. Like I don't want to be like rating it poorly just because the topic is great, but then I also don't want to rate it really highly because I did not super enjoy my reading experience, so definitely felt conflicted. So I feel like 3 stars is a good place to land with this book. I definitely would recommend it to you if you like historical fiction.
And the whole time I was like, what's going on here? I'm scared. And that's just how good the author's writing is. That's just how good the writing in this book is, okay? It is flawlessly done.
The next book was recommended by Chanelle from Chanelle Time, and that is Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. This is a very divisive book. There were plenty of people last year who put it on their favorite list, and there were plenty of people who put it on their least favorite list. I'm gonna go ahead and say I'm with the least favorite people. I would describe this book as an attempt at dark academia. I didn't really like this book, so sorry if my description of it is a bit snarky. So the book centers on a school called Catherine House, which is an institution of higher learning in rural Pennsylvania. It's supposed to be very prestigious, yet not an accredited school. Like they don't describe it as ever being like a traditional college experience, but essentially when students are in high school, they go through this like rigorous application process that would allow them to get into Catherine House. And apparently like everyone who spends 3 years at Catherine House ends up having like wildly successful lives. And it's sort of a very secret society type school. Like if you go there, you don't really talk about your time there, and like very prestigious like scientists and like politicians went there. So our main character is a girl named Inez who had a very troubled senior year, and going to Catherine House is her way of kind of escaping her life. I'm having a hard time like figuring out how to describe it because I truly feel that nothing happens in this book. Also, our main character Inez is very depressed, and most of the time she spends the book disassociated, and she's not very like in touch with like what's going on or how she feels. And so because she is so detached, it makes you have a hard time connecting to the story. I'm sorry, Chanelle, but I am going to have to politely disagree with your recommendation, and if you are at all like me, I would recommend staying far away from Catherine House.
This is one of the weirdest books I read this year. It's probably the funnest reading experience of the year. It's a book I had one of the strongest connections to this year. The references alone to 80s movies and music and TV shows just did something so great for me.
The next book on my list is We Ride Upon Sticks by Quan. This was recommended by Kayla from Books and Lala, and I was so pleasantly surprised by this book. It is so weird, but so fun, so campy. I absolutely loved it. This book takes place in the late 1980s in Danvers, Massachusetts, which is actually where the Salem witch trials took place, and it centers on a field hockey team that signs the devil's book so that they can like do well in their field hockey season. It is such a bizarre concept, but it is, like I said, such a fun book. If I were going to describe it, I would say it reminds me of Netflix's Glow meets Scott Pilgrim versus the World. There are a lot of inanimate objects in this book that talk. Like one of the main characters, Jen, has this like 80s like curly bang coif thing, and they call it the claw. The claw like talks. It has like actually a perspective throughout the book. And then there's also someone who has a hickey that they call Les Splotch that also talks. That's why it kind of reminds me of Scott Pilgrim versus the World, because if you've seen that movie, I'm not really talking about the graphic novel, because the movie has a lot of like editing that kind of like interacts with them, where there'll be like words on the screen and different things. And so I could kind of picture if they were to adapt this book, it would be edited in a similar way. It's just such a weird book, but it's so fun. Like, I don't know how to describe it. Like, I guess it's like sports fiction that has humor. Like, the author is so funny. It's interesting because she's actually a poet and she's written a lot of like poetry collections, but this is like such an interesting narrative. Like, she's so witty with the way she writes. Like, I actually laughed multiple times while reading this book. I liked the diversity that Quan brought into the book. Like, one of the characters is adopted from Vietnam, and then another character is Black, and so it's kind of like this commentary on like what it's like to grow up in a really affluent white area while being a person of color. And so there's some commentary on that. There's also a lot of commentary on like sexism, because they're obviously female athletes in the 80s. And I mean, I don't want to jump the gun, but I will say this might end up on my favorites of 2021, because I could totally see myself rereading this. It's a good time. I highly recommend it. I will totally agree with Kayla and say that this is such a weird and random book, but I highly recommend it and you might like it. And if you're like me and you don't like weird stuff, you might like this though.
This is honestly, I think, the best nonfiction book that I've read. She truly wrote her ass off. There were so many lines where I just had to stop and I was like, holy shit.
And the last but very much not least book is Know My Name by Chanelle Miller. This was recommended by Cindy from With Cindy. She recently rebranded. She was Read with Cindy. Now she's just With Cindy. We're with Cindy no matter what she calls her channel. This is actually a memoir about Chanelle Miller, who was the Stanford survivor of sexual assault with the Brock Turner case. And so this is sort of her story from when she gets assaulted all the way through her court trial. It's a very hard book to read. I definitely only recommend it if you're up to it, because obviously there's a lot about sexual assault in it. It was a very good read. I think it'd be hard for me to rate this. I think if I were gonna give it a star rating, I would say 4 stars, only because of some of the pacing, not because of the topic, obviously. What I love about Chanelle Miller is she has such a way with words in describing her experience and what it's like to go through such a public court case. And I will say one thing about the pacing is it's very slow, but it kind of mirrors what her court case feels like, because I think her court case took like 2 or 3 years. And so it's all about how that kind of ruined her life, because she could not hold down a job. She obviously was anonymous during the trial, so she couldn't even tell people around her if they weren't like close family, like what was going on. And so I just really respected it as a book and I really enjoyed it. I don't really read nonfiction or memoirs very often, but this was definitely a good one. If you have any other recommendations for really good memoirs or anything like this book, let me know down below. But yeah, I would definitely go ahead and say I agree with Cindy. I think this is a really good read, and if you're up for it, then I would highly recommend it. But that brings me to the end of this video.
I am an idiot and did not refocus the camera.
If you have any other ideas for reading experiments that you'd like me to do, or if you do want me to do a reading vlog, let me know. I'm trying really hard to be more consistent with videos this year. I have some more ideas, but if there's anything in particular you want to see from me, and you're all beautiful. Thanks for watching. Oh wait, I got my own outro wrong. Okay. Thanks for watching. Wait, what is it? Thanks for watching. You're all beautiful. Have a nice day. Searching for bases, covering up the hole. I'll fight for your love.